Tonight, I will be starting with two different pieces. One is an observation and the other was an experience. In terms of the observation, it was something that I became acutely aware of in certain circles with regards to any argument about raising the minimum wage. It was not the argument about the obligation to provide people with a living wage, though I think that is a very important conversation. Instead, it was whenever a minimum wage was proposed, the argument would be, well, it is unfair that they will be earning more than blank. And you can fill in the blank. The argument may have been members of the military, hospital workers, nurses, teachers. The argument always being that we shouldn't increase minimum wage because it diminishes the value of the work done by others. Of course, there was never the argument that maybe many of these named professions are underpaid as well. Alas, no. Instead, it was always, we have to diminish something in order to elevate something else. But we'll get back to this. In terms of the experience, way back when I was the rabbi of the Reformed Temple of Rockland in Nyack, New York, we had a member of blessed memory who brought in a scholar in residence, a rabbi from out west, also sadly now of blessed memory. I'll be honest, I don't remember much about his various presentations, but I do remember that this particular member who brought in this rabbi was heavily invested in working with the African American community, to which on a late Saturday afternoon, my congregation was invited, along with our scholar and members of our community, to join in a lovely meal and conversation and presentation by our scholar. At one point, the scholar opened up the floor to a Q&A. Now, I don't remember all the details. It's hard getting old. But somehow, he and a participant got into a vicious intellectual argument over who had it worse, the Jews or the African Americans. By the end, each one was yelling over the other to prove how their experience, be it slavery or 2,000 plus years of anti-Semitism, including the Crusades, the pogroms, and the Shoah, were worse. In a way, it became what some call the Suffering Olympics. It was actually a very low point in my rabbinate, to be honest. I mention this because it was sad to watch passionate people work to diminish the suffering of the other in order to either elevate or to validate their own experience by invalidating the experience of the other. Of course, this left me with the troubling question: who wins at suffering? Of course, the obvious answer is no one wins at suffering. And yet, like the minimum wage argument, all too often, suffering can only be acknowledged if another person or people's suffering is minimized. We read in Parashat Akev, Lo tir'ah mehem, you need have no fear of them, meaning the enemies of Israel. You have but to bear in mind what the eternal your God did to Pharaoh and all the Egyptians. The wondrous acts that you saw with your own eyes, the signs and portents, the mighty hand and the outstretched arm by which the eternal your God liberated you. We all know the story of the parting of the Sea of Reeds, and yet at every Seder, we diminish our cups, even amidst our celebration. As the Midrash teaches, similarly, at the time when Israel crossed the Red Sea, the angels came as usual to chant their praises before God on that night. And God said to them, the works of my hands are drowning in the sea. Will you chant praises? Or to put it another way, even as the Israelites rejoiced in their redemption, God still grieved at the loss of part of God's creation. One experience does not negate the other. I mention this because of an event just a couple of days ago. To quote from the Associated Press in an article written by Jake Coyle, the Toronto International Film Festival has pulled from its lineup a documentary on the Hamas 2023 attack into Israel over what the festival says was footage rights. Organizers for the festival acknowledged on Tuesday that they withdrew Canadian filmmaker Barry Overich's The Road Between Us, The Ultimate Rescue, after initially offering the film a spot in the upcoming edition of the festival. The film chronicles the story of retired Israeli General Noam Tibon, whose efforts to save his family and others during the October 7th, 23 attack was profiled in a 60-minute segment. Representatives for the festival said in a statement that the film's invitation was withdrawn by the festival because general requirements for inclusion in the festival and conditions that were requested when the film was initially invited were not met, including legal clearance of all footage. What was the legal clearance, you might ask? According to the Toronto Film Festival, it required permission from Hamas to use the footage. This was horrific footage that the terrorists proudly streamed live as they assaulted, raped, and murdered over 1,000 Israelis, including peace activists and those attending the Nova Music Festival. If this is true, it is outrageous. As one of my friends had said in a moment of levity, it's like not showing footage at the Nuremberg trials because we didn't get Goebbels. Or that we would require bin Laden to sign off on any footage of the 9/11 attacks. But I suspect there's something more insidious going on. I think it has to do more with people being uncomfortable because the violent images streamed by Hamas of Israelis suffering and dying doesn't play into the larger narrative. The larger narrative being that the only legitimate form of suffering is what is going on with the Palestinians in Gaza. But as we have heard, when you diminish the suffering of one to validate the other, in truth, it diminishes them both. To ignore the violence of October 7th, to forget about the 50 still being held in hostage, does not elevate the suffering and possible starvation of innocent Palestinians. Instead, it diminishes it. Sadly, there is a constant need to invalidate the Jewish experience in order to legitimize Palestinian suffering. We see this playing out over and over and over again. For example, there are some who claim that because the Exodus narrative is not historically accurate, any Jewish presence in the land is invalid. I can go into any number of arguments about why this specious statement is wrong. Let's simply state that any religious canonical text from the Tanakh to the New Testament to the Quran to the Book of Mormon are not history as we know history to be. They are collections of theological writings based on historical memory. Does that mean every and all religious experience is invalid? Does that mean any book that is not 100% accurate is wrong? Does that mean because George Washington in fact did tell lies, does that mean the entire United States endeavor is invalid? Of course not. But that is what happens when one decides to pick and choose from sacred texts in order to diminish one people's lived experience over another. Another example, calling anti-Semitism the hatred of all Semitic peoples, as opposed to what it really is. By the way, the term anti-Semitism was created in 1879 by Wilhelm Marr, a German journalist and politician. He wanted to soften the concept of Jew hate by making it sound more scientific. The term anti-Semitism was always exclusively about Jews. Denying the Holocaust as a way of delegitimizing Israel, which, by the way, Israel would exist even without it, and claiming that Jews are only relatively new to the land, ignores thousands of years of physical presence and connections, which is not only validated by the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and through our Siddur, but also by archaeological evidence. Suffering is not a zero-sum game. And by the way, history is not a zero-sum game either. And no matter where you fall in the state of Israel, denying Jewish experiences and Jewish history does not further one's arguments. And denying or diminishing our experiences should always be rejected as an invalid way of any form of having difficult conversations. And by the way, I would say the same about Palestinian experiences as well. In addition, diminishing the Jewish experience also makes it easier to attack us all, including Jewish students on campus and Haredi Jews walking down the street. If we are perceived as less than or less legitimate, it means our lives have less value. And physical attacks can come just as easily from the left as they can from the right. And we have seen this play out over the last several years. According to the ADL in 2024, they tabulated over 9,300 anti-Semitic incidents across the United States, which represents a 5% increase recorded in 23, which is a 344% increase over the past 5 years and an 893% increase over the past 10 years. This is the highest number on record since the ADL began tracking anti-Semitic incidents 46 years ago. So don't tell me that delegitimizing the Jewish experience is just an intellectual exercise. It has consequences. Sovereignty and self-determination are also not a zero-sum game. For some, it is an uncomfortable truth that Israel has existed as a modern state for nearly 80 years in all of its imperfections. It is not going anywhere. And any intellectual exercise that discusses the end of the Jewish state negates the lives of half of all the world's Jewry. This does not diminish in any way the pursuit for Palestinian autonomy and self-rule, nor does it diminish the horrors they are suffering at the hands of the Netanyahu government, who have willingly played into the hands of Hamas. Hamas, an entity, by the way, who wants its own people to suffer, starve, and die in order to further its own aims. But arguing that the needs of one people negates the needs of the other only further perpetuates these violent struggles. We cannot diminish the suffering of one to the exclusion of the other. Thankfully, it appears with tremendous public pressure, the Toronto Film Festival has reversed course on its decision about showing the documentary on October 7th. As David Koczynski, chair of the World Jewish Congress, said in response, this is more than a scheduling change. It's a stand for truth against those who seek to erase it. And I know what some of you are thinking, but Rabbi, you are not speaking out enough about the suffering of the innocent Palestinians. And I'll be honest, you're right. And that is because I'm having to spend far too much time justifying and defending the legitimacy of Jewish existence. If we can get away from the zero-sum arguments of history and the zero-sum arguments of suffering, there can be real space for sacred, meaningful, powerful, and difficult conversations. But I'll be honest, if I'm consistently having to argue that we even have a right to be at the table, I have no energy left for anything else. And I am exhausted. Everyone wants to be seen and heard. But it only works if we are not blind and willing to see and hear others as well. Any dialogue cannot be a one-way street, because otherwise it is just screaming into the void. Going back to the lesson of the Midrash, when people suffer, God suffers. Suffering is not an either-or. No people has a monopoly on it. Let's stop trying to legitimize one people's suffering over another, because that endeavor diminishes us all and drains our capacity for compassion. Instead, I would encourage us to work together to try to alleviate suffering, to bring about a more peaceful and prosperous future. But let's not do it at the expense of anyone's humanity or lived experiences. For we were all created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, not just those we agree with. Shabbat Shalom.